August 26, 1346. In a muddy field near Crécy, France, 9,000 tired Englishmen are about to fight 30,000 of Europe's best knights. The French have every advantage: more soldiers, big horses with armor, and the most important nobles in Europe fighting with them. They're so sure they'll win that French nobles are arguing over who gets to kill the English king. 4 hours later, 150 French nobles are dead, including princes, dukes, and kings. The English lost 40 men. Not 400, just 40. The age of the armored knight, 500 years of being the strongest in battle, ended in a single afternoon, killed by regular people with sticks and strings. The blind king of Bohemia rode straight into death because he refused to miss the fight. French knights ran over their own soldiers while trying to escape. The Genoese crossbowmen were killed by the very French nobles who paid them. And for weeks afterward, crows ate so much dead noble flesh that they couldn't fly. This is the Battle of Crécy, where old-style fighting died in the mud, where the whole idea of nobility through combat was destroyed by common archers, and where the 100 Years' War truly began with France's most embarrassing defeat. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a weapon that cost 10 shillings destroyed armor worth $1,000, why French knights killed their own hired soldiers in the middle of battle, and how one blind king's suicide charge became the most insanely noble death in military history. Let me set the stage for this massacre. Edward III of England had just landed in Normandy with about 15,000 men, claiming the French throne through his mother. He'd been burning his way across northern France in what was called a chevauchée, basically organized destruction designed to prove the French king couldn't protect his people. The English had just robbed Caen and were trying to escape to English-held Calais when the French army finally caught them. Philip Sixx of France had put together the largest army in all of Christianity. We're talking 30,000 to 35,000 men, including 12,000 heavy cavalry, knights in full-plate armor on armored horses. These weren't just soldiers. This was every important noble in France, plus friendly kings and princes from across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire sent troops. The King of Bohemia came with his entire court. Majorca sent knights. It was like a medieval Avengers assembly, and they all wanted English blood. The French knights were the tanks of medieval warfare. A fully armored knight on an armored horse weighed about a ton. They'd been trained for war since childhood, learning combat since they could walk. Their armor cost more than a peasant village earned in a lifetime. For 500 years, heavy cavalry charges had decided European battles. Foot soldiers existed to be run over. Archers were annoyances. Real men, noblemen, fought with swords on horseback. Edward III knew he was doomed. Outnumbered 3-1, tired from weeks of raiding, low on supplies. But he had something the French didn't respect. 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen, mostly peasants and criminals who'd been practicing with their bows since childhood because English law required it. Every Sunday after church, English males had to practice archery. It was literally illegal to play other sports if you could be practicing with a bow. The longbow was a simple weapon, a 6-foot piece of yew wood. Nothing fancy, but in trained hands it was deadly. These archers could put 12 arrows per minute into a target at 250 yards. That's an arrow every 5 seconds accurately, at the distance of 2.5 football fields. The pull weight was so heavy, 150 to 180 pounds, that scientists can identify longbow archers by their deformed skeletons. Their left arms were inches longer than their right from years of holding that massive pull weight. Edward positioned his army on a hill near Crécy, forcing the French to attack uphill. He arranged his men in 3 groups with the archers forming a V-shape between them, creating overlapping fields of fire. Then he did something that shocked both armies. He had his knights get off their horses and fight on foot. English nobles fighting like common foot soldiers. It was unheard of. But Edward understood something the French didn't. The age of the mounted knight was ending. Edward's decision to have his knights get off their horses sent shockwaves through his own ranks. These men had trained their whole lives for the thunder of the charge, their war horses worth more than gold. To step down and fight like peasants was an insult to centuries of tradition. But Edward forced the issue, reminding them that survival mattered more than pride. And slowly, knights in polished plate began walking into the mud beside archers in wool hoods, a sight no one in all of Christianity had seen before. The English camp was strangely calm the night before the battle. Archers prepared their yew bows, rubbing beeswax into their strings to keep them dry. Stakes were hammered into the earth, and ditches were dug by torchlight. Historical records say that Edward even had meat and ale given out, so his men slept with full stomachs, while the French army staggered hungry into camp after their forced march. Every detail screamed discipline versus arrogance. The English also prepared the battlefield. They dug ditches and holes in front of their position to break up cavalry charges. They drove sharpened stakes into the ground at angles to stab horses. They turned the land into a killing field while the French were still marching, and then they waited. Meanwhile, on the French side, it was chaos disguised as pageantry. Nobles rode past each other in gleaming armor, banners snapping in the wind, each one more magnificent than the last. Dukes and counts argued openly about who would have the honor of leading the charge or of capturing Edward alive for ransom. Some bragged they would bring the English king back in chains before nightfall. Philip VI's attempts to calm his nobles were drowned out by the noise of trumpets and boasts. The army looked less like a disciplined force and more like a tournament gone mad. When dawn broke on August 26th, the French front had to march through the wreckage of Edward's chevauchée. Villages were still smoking, crops burned, livestock scattered. Peasants whispered curses as they watched thousands of armored knights pass their ruined homes. To the French nobility, this was embarrassment that demanded immediate revenge. To the English, it was proof that their strategy of destruction was working. They had turned the land itself into a weapon. Philip II's army arrived at Crécy around 4 p.m. on August 26th, exhausted from a long march. The smart move would have been to rest and attack the next morning. Philip actually ordered a halt, but French nobility didn't do patient. They didn't do tactical. They saw the English on that hill, outnumbered, tired, far from home, and they smelled glory. Every noble wanted to be the one who killed or captured Edward III. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds gathered. A sudden rainstorm soaked the field. The French knights laughed, confident their plate armor would protect them. But the storm meant something very different for missile troops. The English calmly took the strings off their bows and tucked them under their helmets and cloaks, keeping them dry. The Genoese crossbowmen had no such precaution. Their strings stretched and sagged, useless against the tight yew of the longbow. A tiny detail, a few minutes of planning ahead, would decide the fate of thousands. When Philip VI finally arrived at the field and saw the English calmly lined up on the hill, banners fluttering, lines tight, he ordered his army to wait until the next day. But knights don't wait. Behind him, counts and dukes surged forward, shouting that the day was wasting and glory was slipping away. Some had already lowered lances. The king's command dissolved into dust. The French army was no longer an army. It was a mob of impatient aristocrats who refused to let discipline stand in the way of vanity. The Battle of Crécy had begun, not with strategy, but with pride exploding out of control. The French front ignored Philip's orders and began moving forward. Once some nobles started forward, others followed, not wanting to miss the glory. The king lost control of his own army before the battle even began. What followed wasn't a battle. It was an aristocratic mob charging to its death. First came the Genoese crossbowmen, about 5,000 of them, the best hired missile troops money could buy. But there was a problem. Their pavises, large shields they hid behind while reloading, were still with the baggage train. They'd have to move forward without cover. Plus, a brief rainstorm had just passed, and while the English had kept their bowstrings dry under their helmets, the Genoese crossbow strings were wet and stretched, reducing their range. The Genoese moved forward, getting into range about 150 yards, and fired a volley. Most bolts fell short. Then the English responded. 5,000 longbows released at the same time. Witnesses described it as making a sound like thunder. The sky literally darkened with arrows. Each archer was putting out 12 per minute. That's 60,000 arrows per minute falling on the Genoese. The Genoese had no shields, no cover, and their crossbows took 30 seconds to reload versus 5 seconds for a longbow. They were being wiped out. They broke and ran, streaming back toward French lines. And here's where it gets insane. The Count d'Alençon, seeing the Genoese retreating, shouted, "Kill me this rabble that blocks our way!" The French knights charged into their own crossbowmen, trampling and cutting them down. They literally murdered their own hired soldiers for the crime of not dying fast enough. The Genoese were caught between English arrows and French swords. Those who survived fled the field entirely, cursing their employers. Now came the main French assault. 12,000 mounted knights charging uphill through mud over the bodies of dead Genoese into the teeth of English arrows. This is where we need to talk about what a longbow arrow actually did to armor. At long range, arrows might not go through good plate armor, but they didn't need to. They hit horses, which even when armored had weak spots: eyes, mouths, legs. A 2,500-pound horse hit by multiple arrows doesn't charge. It screams, rears, falls, creating a 2,500-pound obstacle. Knights behind crashed into fallen horses. The charge lost all momentum. At closer range, under 100 yards, longbow arrows with bodkin points could punch through mail and even plate armor at weak points. They went through visors into faces, through joints into armpits, through mail into thighs. But even non-penetrating hits were devastating. The impact of an arrow hitting plate armor was like being hit with a hammer. Multiple hits rattled knights inside their armor like dice in a cup. The French came in waves, each one climbing over the dead of the previous charge. The English archers had pre-supplied arrows stuck in the ground in front of them for quick access. They kept up continuous fire. Historical accounts describe arrows falling like snow, so thick that charging knights couldn't see through them. But it wasn't just arrows. The battlefield Edward had prepared now showed its worth. Horses hit the hidden ditches and broke legs. Knights crashed into sharpened stakes. The mud from the earlier rain turned into a slippery hell. Knights who got off their horses in 60 pounds of armor could barely move. They became stationary targets. And here's the detail that perfectly captures the horror. English archers ran out of arrows several times. You know what they did? They ran forward into the field, pulled arrows out of dead and dying French knights, and fired them back. The French were being killed with their own recycled suffering. The blind King John of Bohemia now enters our story with the most insanely noble death in medieval history. John had been blind for a decade but came to fight anyway. When he heard the battle was lost, he reportedly said, "The King of Bohemia does not run from a battle." He ordered his knights to tie their horses' reins to his so they could lead him into combat. He wanted to strike at least one blow with his sword before dying. This blind 50-year-old king charged directly into the English lines, swinging his sword at sounds and shadows. He and all his attached knights were killed immediately. When they found his body, he was still tied to his dead companions, his blind eyes open, his sword in his hand. He'd achieved his wish. He'd struck an enemy before dying. Edward III's son, the Black Prince, was so moved by this display of courage that he took John's personal emblem, ostrich feathers with the motto Ich dien, meaning I serve, which remains the symbol of the Prince of Wales today. As the sun set, the French had charged 16 times, 16 separate waves of nobility throwing themselves into the meat grinder. Each charge was less organized than the last. French nobles were literally fighting each other to get to the front, to have their chance at glory, only to die in the mud like all the others. Philip VI himself charged with the final wave. His horse was killed under him. An arrow went through his jaw. His personal guard had to physically drag him from the field as he tried to return to the battle. The sacred oriflamme, the battle banner of France that supposedly guaranteed victory, was abandoned in the mud. As darkness fell, the English couldn't believe they'd won. They stayed in position all night, killing any wounded French who moved. They'd run out of arrows multiple times and had resorted to using knives, hammers, and stakes to finish off knights who had gotten off their horses. English peasant archers were literally beating French nobles to death with sticks. When dawn came on August 27th, the scale of the slaughter became clear. The cream of French nobility lay dead in the mud. The Count of Flanders, the Count of Blois, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Auxerre, the Count of Sancerre. The list went on and on. 2,500 nobles dead, 11 princes, thousands of lesser knights. The Genoese who hadn't fled were all dead, many killed by their own employers. The English losses, about 40 dead, including only 2 knights. 1 English knight versus 750 French nobles. The difference was so extreme that writers at the time didn't believe it. Some claimed divine intervention, but the reality was simpler. The longbow had made heavy cavalry obsolete in a single afternoon. But here's the truly devastating part. It wasn't just the deaths. It was who died. Medieval warfare usually involved capturing nobles for ransom. It was a gentleman's agreement. You didn't kill people worth money. But at Crécy, the English archers, common men with no understanding of or care for chivalry codes, simply killed everyone. They put arrows through the faces of dukes and counts without knowing or caring who they were. The psychological impact on European nobility was shattering. For 500 years, being a knight meant being militarily superior. Your noble blood, blessed by God, made you better at war than commoners. Crécy proved that a Welsh peasant with a stick could kill you just as dead as another knight. That military superiority didn't come from blood, but from technology and tactics. The entire social order of medieval Europe was challenged. The aftermath was disgusting. So many nobles died that there weren't enough people of appropriate rank to bury them properly. Bodies lay rotting for days. Crows and wolves feasted on princely flesh. Local peasants robbed noble corpses, finding enough wealth to transform their lives. The armor that couldn't save its wearers was melted down and sold. The English army, exhausted and shocked by their own victory, continued their march to Calais. They left behind a field so thick with noble corpses that locals renamed it the Field of the Cloth of Gold for all the expensive clothing on the dead. For years afterward, farmers plowing the field would turn up noble bones and rusted armor. France went into shock. The loss of so many nobles in one day created a power vacuum. Entire regions lost their lords. Government systems collapsed. The French military had to be completely restructured. They started hiring more crossbowmen, building their own archer corps, and most embarrassingly, copying English tactics of fighting on foot. The battle also created a new kind of warfare. The dominance of the longbow meant battles became longer-range affairs. The age of glorious cavalry charges was over. Wars became about positioning, preparation, and firepower rather than courage and swordplay. The romance of medieval combat died in the mud at Crécy, but France didn't learn immediately. 10 years later at Poitiers, they did the exact same thing, charged English archers positioned on a hill with the exact same result. They lost another king and thousands more nobles. It took the French nearly a century to fully adapt to the new reality that common archers were more valuable than noble knights. The social implications were even more profound. If peasant archers could destroy noble knights, what did that say about the divine right of nobility? If common Welsh criminals could kill princes, what justified the feudal system? Crécy didn't just kill French nobles. It killed the idea that noble blood meant military superiority. The English longbowmen became the most feared troops in Europe. But here's the ironic part. The longbow's dominance was temporary. It required a lifetime of training to use effectively. You couldn't create longbowmen quickly. When gunpowder weapons arrived, which any peasant could learn to use in a day, the longbow became obsolete too. The weapon that killed chivalry was itself killed by progress. The blind king of Bohemia became a legend. His suicidal charge was seen as the last pure expression of chivalric honor, choosing certain death over retreat, wanting to strike one blow for glory even in blindness. His death represented the end of an era when nobility meant something beyond wealth, when honor mattered more than survival. Modern military historians study Crécy as a revolution in warfare. It proved that technology and tactics trumped numbers and courage, that prepared defensive positions beat charging cavalry, that disciplined firepower beats individual combat skills. Every modern military principle was demonstrated in that muddy field in 1346. But the most lasting image from Crécy is this: French knights, the proud nobility of the greatest kingdom in all of Christianity, trampling their own allies to death in their rush to die gloriously, while English peasants calmly shot them down like target practice. The Count d'Alençon, who ordered the massacre of his own Genoese crossbowmen, was himself shot through the face with an arrow moments later. The French literally killed more of their own men than the English killed Englishmen. The crows that feasted on noble corpses became so fat on princely flesh that locals reported they could barely fly. They would hop from corpse to corpse, too bloated to take wing. It was the perfect metaphor. Even the scavengers were overwhelmed by the death of so much nobility. Today, a small monument marks the field at Crécy. Tour buses rarely stop. Most people have never heard of it. But on August 26, 1346, on that muddy slope, the medieval world ended. 500 years of military tradition, the entire concept of warrior nobility, the romance of knightly combat, all of it died in an afternoon, killed by commoners with bent sticks and string. The English didn't just win a battle at Crécy. They proved that courage couldn't beat mathematics, that nobility couldn't stop arrows, and that the age of the knight was ending. The French lost more than nobles that day. They lost their entire understanding of how the world worked, and all it took was 5,000 peasants who practiced archery every Sunday after church.